We're going to be moving on to our Indigenous food sovereignty panel. Coming up in a little bit, we'll be hearing from Don Morrison talking about decolonizing our food systems. That'll be coming up in a bit. But first, we'll be hearing from Karen Blondenhall. Will be leading us in a discussion about some of the challenges we as Indigenous folks and people face and how that affects access to food. Karen Blondenhall is a member of the Delaunay First Nation and grew up in Yellowknife. She currently works as a senior advisor of Indigenous Health for the Government of the Northwest Territories Department of Health and Social Services, where she is the lead of the Cultural Safety Anti-Racism File. Karen holds a MA in Studies in Policy and Practice from the University of Victoria, where she focused her studies on Indigenous health inequities as a result of colonialism, racism, Indigenous ways of knowing, and cultural safety. I've had the opportunity to work with Karen Blondenhall, and always learn a lot, and I'm so happy that she's able to come here on our Anti-Poverty Roundtable to share a little bit about herself and her work. Nice to see you there again, Karen. And the Anti-Poverty Roundtable floor is virtually all yours.
Thank you so much, Denise. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just wondering if my presentation is able to get pulled up.
We're just checking on that
okay,
right now.
Thank you. So I'm not going to get into introductions. Denise already did that, and I know I only have about 10 minutes. So as he mentioned, though, my work does focus on this concept of cultural safety in the health and social services system. And so I'm going to start by defining what cultural safety is. And as I mentioned, it's a concept that's mainly used in healthcare settings, and it's defined as an outcome where Indigenous peoples feel safe and respected, free of racism and discrimination when accessing health and social services. So in other words, we are working to eliminate, okay, there we go, racism in our system. And when racism is occurring within our mainstream Canadian systems or institutions, we call that systemic racism. So you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with food insecurity? And I'll be the first to admit that I don't have in-depth knowledge about food insecurity, but what I can bring to this conversation is a systemic racism lens to food insecurity, because the same factors that are affecting inequities for Indigenous peoples when they access health and social services are the same that are causing food insecurity challenges. And I know that food insecurity is a systemic racism issue because it disproportionately affects Indigenous peoples, which ultimately means that this is a race-based issue that is affecting one racial population and not the dominant white population. So next, I'll walk you through a framework that I use to explain systemic racism and how it manifests in health and social services. And then I will use that framework to explain food insecurity from a systemic racism lens. Next slide, please. Okay, so what I found helpful in my work is to use a tree analogy. And this idea is not my own idea. This comes from an Indigenous health scholar. Her name is Dr. Charlottelopey. But first, I will ask you to look at the bottom of the image where the roots are. And in yellow is where I describe that the roots symbolize the historical events that are rooted in any race-based issue that we are examining. The roots are the foundation to the issue and responsible for what manifests in the rest of the tree, so the trunk and the leaves. So for example, in the right-hand side, I've listed the historical context of Canada, which include colonialism, racism, and social exclusion, and self-determination that Indigenous peoples had prior to colonization. The roots obviously feed into the trunk or the systems that have been created as a result of this historical context. And it's at this level where racism is harder to see or tease out because racism has been so normalized and embedded within our systems, societies through policies, institutional practices, and norms that I have highlighted there that ultimately center privilege Western knowledge. So some examples that I've listed here are how the health system condone or allow racism to take place. So at that interpersonal one-on-one level, we hear many examples of that. I've just come from a meeting, the federal, territorial, provincial meeting on anti-Indigenous racism in healthcare, where I'm hearing lots of examples of how racism is taking place on a one-on-one basis. We also see it in the lack of diversity within our healthcare systems and who is working within our systems. So if we have over 50% Indigenous people working or living in the Northwest Territories, then we really should expect to see that many Indigenous people working within our system. And that is one way of addressing racism. We also see it in the dominance of the biomedical model, which ultimately means that there's an absence of Indigenous knowledge and healing within the system. So finally, the leaves of the tree represent the outcomes or impacts from what has happened at the roots and the trunk levels. And in healthcare settings, racism itself translates to direct health outcomes such as stress, hypertension, low self-esteem, life expectancy, and even death. It also translates to a decreased access to care as a result of negative racist experiences, which causes fear, mistrust, avoidance, and reluctance. Okay, next slide, please. So using the same framework, we can analyze food insecurity. So again, starting at the bottom, we look at the historical context to food insecurity. And really, I've plotted all of this information based off of what I heard yesterday. So I heard participants talk about how complex foodways and practices are tied to Indigenous people's health and well-being from a spiritual, cultural, mental, emotional, and physical standpoint. We also know that Indigenous peoples experience their highest state of health and well-being when they are self-determining communities. But as we know, the state of our communities have been disrupted by colonial policies like residential schools and separating Indigenous peoples from their traditional lands, which were fueled by racist ideas that Indigenous peoples and our ways of life were inferior to Western and European ways. So this context cannot be separated from the next level, Canadian mainstream systems that have emerged from this history. Yesterday, some of the things that I heard that would fall in this category are government regulations. And here, I'm not going to read them all out to you, but you can read them yourself to see that these are some of the things that we talked about yesterday. And ultimately, this context cannot be separated from the Canadian mainstream systems that have emerged from this history. Oh, 1 minute left, thanks, sorry. And really, they are underpinned by a pattern of Western ideas and practices that are making decisions and determining the direction for another racial group. And that racial group is obviously Indigenous peoples. This analysis also can include an examination of the lack of Indigenous peoples working within decision-making roles and policy roles. And finally, I have 3 more bullets left. At the top here is where I've listed food insecurity related outcomes affecting Indigenous peoples. And I think overall, this framework can really be helpful when looking at any race-based issues and disparities. And it always reminds us that we have to look at the historical roots, the colonization, racism, lack of self-determination for Indigenous peoples that have been embedded within our mainstream institutions and manifesting in new and more implicit ways. And then finally, it also points us to where solutions are likely to have the most impact. And that involves looking at the roots of the issue. And that's it for me. Masi Cho for listening. I hope you learned something new.
I appreciate that, Karen. Nice to virtually get to hang out with you during this anti-poverty roundtable. Always good to speak about these things. Before we move on, I know some of these topics might be uncomfortable for some people when we talk about racism, colonialism, systemic racism, and privilege. So, as a moderator, I just wanted to say that this is time now to build not only a safe space for this discussion virtually at our roundtable, but to go a little step further and to create a brave space for all the participants out there to not lean back for the discomfort, but kind of lean into it, to be brave enough to lean into it, to try to learn about it, to try to understand it. And one of the ways to overcome these things is to be aware of them and to call them out so that we can know those things are there. And thanks for laying it out. I like the framework that we used, Karen. And I want to thank you for your bravery in doing this work as well, too. All right. Thanks to Karen Blondenhall. Up next, we have Don Morrison. Don will talk about decolonizing our food systems and is the founder and curator of the Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty. Don is a Secwepemc from ancestry from British Columbia. Don has worked and studied horticulture, ethnobotany, adult education, and restoration of natural systems in formal institutions, as well as through her own personal and community healing and learning journey. Don's work on the decolonizing research and relationship is focused on creating a critical pathway of consciousness that shines the light on the cross-cultural interface where Indigenous food sovereignty meets social justice, climate change, and regenerative food systems research, action and policy, planning, and governance. With that, we'll turn it over to... Oh, okay. I think John is still logging on, but again, a lot of these concepts that Karen laid out again could be a little bit scary, but yeah, this will be our safe, brave space for us to talk about these issues and to learn from each other about these issues to try to understand. It's when we talk about anti-poverty, there's anti-racism. If something comes up that is racist, the best way to combat that is to say something about it and to call it out. Sometimes we want to be quiet and not say anything, but when it comes to issues like that, your silence is almost like acquiescence, meaning if you don't say anything, you're just kind of perpetuating these type of ideals and stuff. So it's really important to be brave and to call these things out when we see them. So I just wanted to add those sorts of things, and I think those sorts of things are really, really important. But with that, right now, we'll go to the founder and curator of the Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty, Don Morrison. We're so happy to have you here. The Anti-Poverty Roundtable floor is virtually yours there, Don.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. And I apologize for being a little late. I'm having a hard time juggling all the different time zones and responses to all the stuff going on in the communities. And I'm super honored to be invited here into your panel discussion around anti-poverty work as it relates to the work I've been doing, as you mentioned, as the founder and curator of the Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty. I've been working for the last 15 years and talked to literally thousands of people, Indigenous people, on the topic of Indigenous food sovereignty. So have a pretty good insight into the ways that is related to poverty and many of the other social determinants of health, where we know Indigenous peoples do experience huge diversity. We know that as Indigenous peoples as well, we're also really good at working in complexity because we know that we are all related and everything is interconnected, and that's challenging working in the colonial reality where everything is fragmented and reduced to simpler terms. And while that's helpful in some cases, it doesn't help us to understand huge complex problems around food insecurity and all of the other kind of multiple overlapping crises that we're experiencing right now in terms of the global food insecurity, the COVID-19, the public health crises, the climate change, capitalism crumbling before our eyes, and the colonial reality that is really unable to deal with the complexity in a lot of ways. And while it plays a role in helping us to address these complex problems, because that's the reality that's there. But we also know that Indigenous peoples, we've been able to live the reality and enjoy an abundance of food for thousands and thousands of years. So poverty, in the sense of the term and the way we're experiencing that in the colonial reality, is there's a beautiful movement that's happening around decolonizing wealth and really looking at how do we look at wealth and how do we look at poverty, and especially in a system that has actually instituted poverty. And I understand that Karen presented prior to me, and I'm really sorry I missed that. That was an important part. I was really wanting to see how it was being contextualized in up north in your territory, in the Northwest Territories. So without having seen that presentation, I can tell you that our working group on Indigenous food sovereignty has developed a decolonizing food system cross-cultural interface framework. And really it's a tool to help give structure and create cultural safety in spaces around research and policy and planning and governance, as a way to give some structure and some tools and terminology to be able to go through kind of even a non-exhaustive process of transcending some of the contradictions, identifying some potential that is really infinite. There's lots of things we can do. There's lots of strategies that live in the gaps of knowledge. And a lot of those gaps of knowledge have been created because the system of like food systems research and policy planning and governance, the existing system has kind of made us invisible in terms of the broader scope and scale of our hunting and our fishing and our gathering, and the strength, the wealth that lives in those ancient strategies where we've been able to achieve food sovereignty for literally thousands of years and live that reality. But how do we appreciate and inquire into that now? So that is the basis we're coming from, to decolonize wealth and to decolonize our mentality around poverty, and not to try and gloss it over and think that poverty doesn't exist, because we know there are huge gaps of disparity in the social determinants of health, one of which is, poverty and the high rates of the cultural and ecological influences of mainstream society that that have kind of caused a lot of the problems around like the trauma, the addictions, how that's related to people's lifestyles and unhealthy eating, lack of nutrition, and how that plays into mental health and our ability to function and to operate in a society where it doesn't really represent our ancient ways of being on the land and being in an intimate relationship with our food through a lot of the spiritual and cultural protocols, which still persist in many, most nations that I've visited over the last 15 years still observe those protocols. It may not be to as wide of an extent, but we're really seeing that there are a lot of projects happening across Canada and Turtle Island and even around the world, where people are realizing that by bringing back those traditions and those values around observing those cultural and spiritual protocols, simply in essence and by nature of bringing that back and participating in those ancient ways is a conservation method. It is our economy. It is our wealth. And we see that in measurable ways. That's a little more challenging now because of something like, well, the climate change. It's very uncertain, and many of the elders have told us that we can't necessarily predict, and the ecological indicators encoded in our languages and our cultures may not apply so much anymore in some cases because of the way of climate change and the things we're seeing happen. But there are some really solid teachings of how to embrace the uncertainty and how to kind of decolonize our thinking around wealth and poverty. And so, I mean, that's just one aspect. I think the basis of which we've heard Indigenous peoples speak about the importance of coming from that basis. But it's also important to recognize there is a huge need to kind of dismantle the system of the structures and the processes in colonial policy planning and governance that are at the root cause of some of the biggest systemic challenges of the 21st century. And those systemic challenges are what have instituted the poverty. And looking at our work in the downtown east side of Vancouver at the Strathcona Park, where we were awarded a residency by the city of Vancouver. Right now we have a tent city. So about 200 homeless people camping in tents. In the summer, it was more like about 500 tents. Think of multiple people living in those tents. Think of people who are legitimately homeless and needing a place to live, combined with some really high risk offenders dealing with addictions and such. So anyways, I know I'm out of time, so I'll leave it at that. But I think there is a real need to really advocate for systemic changes. And again, apologize for not hearing what was said earlier about that, because I'm sure there's a lot of good thinking already there. So
Well,
thank you.
Dawn, thank you for that presentation and for your insight and for your knowledge. And yeah, I think it's really important to try to reframe our thinking when it comes to a lot of this terminology and that we're working with. Like as an Indigenous person, I've been told that our legends and our history is more like myth. But for me, from learning a little bit more, there's more colonial myths out there about the reality of our situation. They would say our languages are primitive, our histories are a thing of the past, not something that a modern society can use. But those are all colonial myths. In fact, our Indigenous languages are really sophisticated and subtle. Our knowledge is intimate and makes sense of the complexities of this world as well too. I'm really happy that you brought all that out, and I'm so excited about the work that you're doing, and we're really happy that you can be part of our anti-poverty roundtable here as well too. So we heard from Karen Blondenhall and also Don Morrison. I want to thank them both for their perspectives on empowering Indigenous peoples to decolonize and to define our own food systems.